As part of Regenuary Conversations, I'm here with Registered Nutritionist Tim Rees, and pleased to say that you are able to join us from Germany. You are a Brit living in Germany, and I can't say I blame you. It sounds very beautiful where you are, but I think I should hand over and let you explain how and when we met and what you do.
All right, cool. So so we first met after I wrote a few articles. There was a takedown article on the Game Changers fantasy adventure sci-fi movie, and then I wrote one about the World Health Organization, which I think is linked. You guys have linked under my kind of profile.
Yes. Because you post a lot on Medium, right? That's
I did, yeah. And then I posted on Medium, then I put it up on my website. My website is the equivalent of like an elephant's graveyard for blogs. So then I put it back on Medium, and so it's available there. And I'll probably put the Game Changers ones there too, just because people find that their SEO is so much better than mine's ever going to be. So then we hooked up when I was in town, hooked up in the British sense, not the American, for a coffee. We met whilst I was in town doing these corporate presentations about mental health, and really I kept the presentation really simple. It was about the nutrients required to build neurotransmitters in the brain responsible for good brain function, and shown to be often to be dysregulated, if you like, in the brain. Things, the serotonin and noradrenaline and dopamine, really. But so to build those neurotransmitters, you need nutrients, and in this world of overnourishment in these developed countries like the UK and the US, we're so spoiled. We get all this food, but we're actually undernourished. So we end up being short on nutrients.
But also over too many calories and not enough nutrition.
Exactly, yeah. Loads of energy and not enough nutrients, because the foods we choose are high in energy and low in nutrients. So you end up fat and undernourished and unwell. But then add that to these lives we live, which are really high in stress, chronic stress. So when you're chronically stressed, you need more nutrients. But people default to poor food choices when they're stressed because often they can make you feel better in the short term. Sugar is a classic example of that.
So you get that sort of. So by chronic stress, you mean sort of low-level continuous stress rather than short bursts of intense stress.
Exactly, yeah.
I would argue we're actually very well equipped to deal with like fight or flight. There's a bear in the cave type thing, but not like 7-day-a-week low-level stress that causes us to want to feel better about ourselves. So we eat things that stimulate dopamine and serotonin.
That's it. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. So acute stress has been a part of our evolution and has shaped our being modern humans. And we're more than equipped to deal with that. In fact, it's a necessary stress. But chronic stress, all these things, so it can be triggered by low nutrient diets. It can be triggered by poor sleep, by these kind of quite recent discoveries like bright lights at night, lots of blue light, messing up your circadian rhythm, messing up your sleep. So constantly tired, really, and then add that to shitty jobs. I'll try not to swear. Add that to jobs we don't like, and to just modern lifestyles in a nutshell. And then you combine that with the low nutrient diets and these kind of addictive type behaviors that we all have. Suddenly, you are shaping the perfect environment for chronic disease. But in the talk, I touch on that really by just saying that in the modern world, we're actually, there's a surprising amount of malnourishment. And obviously, you don't have to look far to see the enormous amount of overweight and obesity. Now there are actually more people in the world that are overweight than underweight, and that is all happening in the developed world, really. And
I just find that sort of whole concept, I think people don't really get, is that it is possible to be overweight and malnourished at the same time. And that's a modern kind of epidemic. You tend to think of people who are malnourished as being sort of wasting away skinny, and like victims of famine or drought or things like that. That's malnourishment. But in actual fact, there are people walking around in industrialized cities carrying 20 kilos of extra weight who are malnourished.
Yeah. If you show me an overweight person or certainly an obese person, I'll show you a malnourished person. And this is just one of those variables that kind of makes the calorie in, calorie out thing more complex, because when you start adding things like chronic inflammation, which is obesity is a chronic inflammatory state. When you start adding that problem, you start seeing a change of how the body responds to calories. How the body stores fat, how the hormones change the way we respond to the amount of calories we have and the energy we're eating, and all these different systems that are altered because we're in a chronic inflammatory state. And you don't have to be overweight to be in a chronic inflammatory state. You can be chronically ill, which can just be bad luck, or it can be because of the reasons I've already discussed, the low nutrients or, lots of stress, whatever. There's a million different things.
Can I jump back into what you said earlier when you were coming over when we met for a cup of coffee in central London? I think you'd just given a lecture at a business there, and you were talking about eating for mental health. You mentioned earlier that bad foods can create stress that cause you then to crave more bad food. That's like a negative feedback loop that leads people into a state of ill health. But what can somebody do as a very sort of simple takeaway? What, if you don't mind kind of giving us the elevator pitch for your talk, what were you telling people?
So I summarized the talk to 3 points that they could take away, and kind of a final slide, which was to remove processed grains, to remove added sugars, and to remove modern vegetable oils. So those are extruded vegetable oils that literally didn't exist until the technologies in about 1912 and 1910 came about, where it allowed companies to take non-oily things, let's say cotton seeds, for example, or soybeans, which are a little bit oilier, and turn them into oils. The beauty of it was that cotton seeds were a waste product, which means they were super cheap. You had Procter & Gamble, for example. These were really the company that drove this. And they bought the technology from the German chemist who came up with hydrogenation, but they would buy cotton seeds and they would turn them into an oil. Then they would hydrogenate them with this technology they bought and turn them into a fat that looked like lard and was sold to people as a healthy, pure vegetable oil alternative to lard. And of course, there was no science behind it. It was full. It was nonsense. And in those days, they could just tell you anything. I mean, nowadays, it's fairly easy to tell the public anything too. But so to summarise it, it's no processed grains or try to reduce them. Added sugars also, and vegetable oils, modern vegetable oils.
I'd like to kind of dip into each of those 3 things, if we may, and I think that will give us a bit of structure for this conversation. Which sort of seems like a good direction to go in. So we'll start at the top. Yeah, I think the first thing you said was processed grains. So is there a big difference between whole grains and processed grains, and how do they affect us differently? And also, I think if you could, when you answer this, can you talk about the difference maybe perhaps between organic, regenerative, natural methods of farming and industrial methods of farming, and how that might affect the end result.
Yeah, I mean, there are a huge amount of jumping off points there. Yeah.
Sorry, I've probably thrown 4 questions into one there.
No, I mean, it's great. I mean, I'll try not to get too distracted, and we can kind of go back and touch some of the jumping off points. So the audience are just your average Joe working in a whatever company. So I keep it simple. So I say no refined grains, or eliminate or try to reduce refined grains. And the real reason behind that is because they make up so much of junk food. And what I'm trying to do is get people away from junk food in a general sense. When I see individuals, what I recommend is much more bespoke, and it's shaped to them, to their what is going to work and what's going to be realistic for them, right? So that is something different. When I'm talking to an audience of all sorts of different people, really, what I'm just trying to do is get them away from junk food and trying to get them to nourish themselves with real foods. Now, I have an opinion about grains. Anyway, yeah. I think grains really come from a time this is quite a big statement, but perhaps an ancient time of oppression, of when times were hard, when climate change, caused in part by human activities, and also by certainly what I'm thinking here is the Fertile Crescent, very long time ago, becoming less fertile, and people looking for new sources of nutrition.
And the Fertile Crescent, that would have been across North Africa and the Middle East, would it?
Basically. So yeah.
We're looking back 4,000-6,000 years. Is that?
So further. So the Fertile Crescent, which by the way is still fertile in areas and still green and lush. When we talk about the Middle East, we picture deserts, but actually they do still have a Fertile Crescent. But what we're really talking about is you might call it the kind of cradle of humanity, where really humanity really started to take off, and that's for no other reason that the environment was easiest. So it's before humans kind of spread out all across the world. And it's at a time when life was easy. And that's because there was loads of food around. It was humid, and they could, the food was literally coming to their doorsteps. And so some of them stopped being nomadic. They started settling because food was just so abundant. So when that started changing was about 12,000 years ago, and they had to start getting cleverer, and that's when they started using grains more, and they started they started doing things that we would associate as farming now.
Right. This is the birth of agriculture, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. But before that, there's evidence of eating grains all the way back to 105,000 years ago. That's the oldest evidence. But that would just be as part of their kind of hunting and gathering. Their,
it wasn't a staple. You mean it was?
No, exactly.
It was part of the very varied diet. Okay, they weren't.
It wasn't a staple. Yeah, it wasn't a staple, and it's no way it made up a large percentage of their diet. So what we're talking about really is from maybe 12,000 years ago when people started eating it more. But the evidence of grains shows that they were definitely processing it themselves. So they had worked out, and nobody knows when they started working this out, but they worked out they needed to process it, they needed to soak it, they needed to grind it, to dry it, and to
right, because you're not just going to pick up a handful of wheat and chew on it.
No, exactly. Yeah. So at some time previous to 105,000 years ago, they had worked out that grains were edible, but they needed to be processed. a lot of people, the trouble with nutrition is so many people have these kind of black and white opinions, but it's all so much more nuanced than that. There's no way that grains are poisonous to humans, full stop, because a hell of a lot of people are eating grains their whole life and not dying at 40. But then there are other people undeniably that eat grains that are being made very unwell. And it might be really obvious in the case of celiac disease, or it might not be really obvious. It might be something that is degrading them. And mental health can be one of those things. There are lots of studies that show that, you can have a non-celiac reaction to grains that can affect your mental health. And that can be anxiety, or it can be crazy things like, crazy is not a great word to use in that instance, but psychosis. It can literally trigger psychosis.
Wow.
And the removal of grains, and there are lots of case studies, but
so can I just jump in here? Why is that? Is this because there is some like non-celiac allergic type reaction happening to something in the grains? And is it all grains, or is it processed modern grains? Like, are we talking everything from rice to barley to wheat to to quinoa to whatever, or are we more specifically talking about wheat here?
So we are talking. It's more likely to be wheat, but the problem is gluten. So many people can eat things like rice, which is obviously doesn't have any gluten in, and not have a problem. But the nuance here is that it really depends on the individual. Yeah. So this. Try and keep on subject, but one of the most powerful things I do is to exclude lots of things if people can handle that. And I've seen so many conditions, including my own personal experience, get better when I and others exclude lots of things, and gluten is right at the top of that list.
Right.
So
sorry. This is when you're working with individual clients. The first thing you'll do is an elimination type diet to try and work out what might be causing their ill health. Okay.
Yeah. Because quite frankly, there are no tests exist that are ironclad. And the annoying thing about testing is that often it can give you a false flag. It'll say, oh, you have a problem with this, or you don't have a problem with that. So if a test comes back and says they're fine on gluten because they've only tested it in certain ways, or let's say they go through their doctor and they ask for a celiac test and it comes back negative, and now they think to themselves, well, I'm fine with gluten, so they keep eating bread. But the truth is they're not. And actually, the best way to discover whether or not you have a problem,
take it away.
Take it away and just ask yourself, do I feel better?
Yeah, sure. Simple. And are these tests, the tests you're talking about, are we talking blood tests that are looking for inflammation markers, or is it gene testing, or what kind of tests are you talking about?
So I don't think gene testing really has the gene thing. That's not telling us enough, right? Because at the moment they're like, okay, these certain genes they're telling us certain things that might give you a margin of whether or not you're going to be affected by in a certain way or by a certain thing. But the truth is that a lot of these genes we think are telling us things, but then we discover as we start researching, when I say we, I mean geneticists, what have you. When we start looking at other genes, we start discovering that they have the opposite effect. So the net result is not as clear.
And then there's the epigenetic effect of the lifestyle influencing the genes. Okay.
The epigenetic effect, which is obviously how the environment affects the way your genes express, and therefore what manifests, that is yet another variable.
Sure.
So, like I read something just the other day about the BRCA gene, the BRCA1, BRCA2 gene, breast cancer gene.
Yeah.
Now they're discovering or it's not as clear as the BRCA gene increasing your likelihood of having breast cancer by 70 or 80%. They're saying now, actually, there are other genes that come along which actually lower your chances. So that means, yeah.
You think of all those women that have elected for double mastectomies and hysterectomies on the basis of a BRCA gene.
I know, right?
May or may not have been needed. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry, we've jumped around a bit there. We have talking about gluten and tolerance.
Yeah. So circling back to kind of my advice about grains. I mean, I look, if people want to eat grains, and they do, because very often they have a direct effect on how people feel. There's a few different mechanisms. It can be a blood sugar thing, it can be an opioid thing, and even sometimes if you actually feel bad, if you feel good eating grains, that can often be a sign that they're actually not very good for you, because you have this kind of response which might, in the short term, make you feel better, but in the long term, it could have all sorts of wacky effects on you. And I get opposition, like when somebody says to me, I really don't want to go gluten-free, right? Like, I mean, actually, so I don't want to go into specifics, but somebody might say to me, oh, I'd much prefer to do, I've just read this book and I want to do intermittent keto rather than go gluten-free. And I'm like, well, okay, well, that is basically gluten-free because for certain reasons. And that's a hell of a lot more complex than just swapping out your bread for gluten-free bread, just as an experiment, just a diagnostic test by removing it. And that tells me something about them as a client. It tells me that are they addicted to this? Do they have a problem with that? Because they have been like, I do not want to give up gluten. Do not take away my bread. So yeah, that in itself is kind of a diagnostic test for me.
Right. Is the person's reaction to the thought of the elimination diet?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, one of my questions is to them is, which foods do you fear me telling you to kind of give up? So whole grains. So really, the difference between whole grains and refined grains are not really as profound as people probably believe. If someone is having a reaction to grains, then it doesn't matter which is, if it's refined or otherwise. They need to be removed, if they want to get well. But generally speaking, I don't tell people to give up grains completely. I'm just telling them to eat, let's say, whole grains, because they're less likely to end up eating biscuits, and more likely to have maybe a piece of rye bread with scrambled egg and smoked salmon, right?
I've got you, yeah. Right. So it's about, it's a sort of a bit of a trick, if you like, to get people to just eating more whole foods rather than processed foods. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. That's it in a nutshell. And I say to people, try to nourish yourself every meal you have, rather than going after some form of entertainment. Which is what biscuits and very often things like sandwiches and what have you.
Empty calories. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. People are looking for entertainment, which is where the kind of dopamine thing comes in.
Sure. But food gives pleasure, but there is absolutely that element to it. But I've been through my own life. I've tried different eating strategies and diets, if you like, and it's funny, I don't find any less pleasure from a well-cooked meal using natural ingredients than I would do. That gives me the same satisfaction in a different way, I think, to something junk which feels a bit hollow. So I will have the occasional slice of a pizza at a kid's party or a birthday cake or something. You definitely get that kind of, but it's short and it's short and it doesn't sit well an hour later. It's a short hit.
Oh yeah.
So that's kind of your presentation, that's the grains part. The other two were processed sugars and vegetable oils. So let's take them in order. So you advise people to cut back on processed sugars. Again, is there a difference between natural and processed sugars? And is it more about getting people to eat less processed food at the end of the day?
That's it. So all three of those things have the same goal in mind, which is to remove junk and to swap it for real foods that have nutrients. Excuse me. So telling people to remove added sugar is another kind of general, just kind of useful piece of advice, because it means they stop eating Haribo and drinking Coke. And it means that they might then just have a better lunch or a better supper. And that's really it. I mean, in terms of, obviously there is a difference between added sugars and the sugars you find, the natural sugars in food. Natural sugars are wrapped up with nutrients and other things like fibers, which come with benefits. They come with micronutrients and more macronutrients versus something that is just nothing but calories. So like you say, those 3 points really are about shaping the whole idea of nourishing oneself rather than just eating for pleasure and never thinking about nutrients.
No, that makes total sense. And the final point of that, which is the one that I'm hoping we can maybe sort of go a little bit deeper on, because it kind of relates to my business, The Ethical Butcher, is talking about the difference between fats and oils. And I think I'm right in saying this, but our great grandparents would have had very few cooking fats available to them. They would have had lard from pork fat, they would have had tallow from beef fat, and then they probably would have had butter. And that was about it. I mean, rendered fats from meats and dairy fat was pretty much all they had to cook with. And I think I'm right in saying, but fats are essential to human life. We cannot live without fats. There are various points and cases where this has been proven. I think there's the rabbit experiment or something where I forget where it was, at some point in history, where people were living on a diet of only rabbit meat, and they all eventually became extremely. There wasn't enough fat.
Rabbit starvation.
Rabbit starvation. So we need fat, and industrial vegetable oils have replaced the animal fats. There's a whole bigger conversation in here as to the politics behind that, which I bet you'd love to get into. But yeah, can you just sort of, I think probably the best starting point here is, what is the difference sort of biochemically between the fats from animal foods, which a lot of evidence is now pointing to the fact that it isn't bad for us, it never has been bad for us, and in actual fact is quite healthy. And seed oil fats, and how they're different, and where did this thing come from to say that, animal fats are going to give us atherosclerosis and heart disease?
So we're combining two of my loves here, nutrition and history.
Right.
And 3 maybe controversy as well. So
I know you're not shy of a bit of a debunk.
Yeah, absolutely. So right, this is cool because so out of the 3 of my kind of recommendations, the vegetable oil one I think is the most important. Because if you look back at, let's say, the turn of the 20th century, and you can do that quite easily by looking at old recipe books. There's one called the Baptist Ladies Cookbook, which is an American kind of West thing, when people were kind of going out there, settling and what have you. But let's not get into that controversy. But so the recipes are all full of grains, sugars, but the fats are all butter and lard and dripping.
Right.
there are no examples of vegetable oils, because they just simply didn't exist. So I wrote an article on Medium. It was actually, to date, it's been my kind of best one ever. About 500,000 people read it, which has been great. But the funny thing was so many people attacked me when they saw my third point, which was vegetable oils. And they were attacking me and shouting, olive oil, and I'm like, you didn't read the article, did you? You just stopped at the word vegetable and you freaked, because olives are fruits. And we're not talking about fruit oils. Yeah. Fruit oils are coconut, olive, and avocado.
Which are great.
And they can be pressed, and they've been pressed by humans for thousands of years.
So are they chemically more similar to animal fats then than the seed oils? Is that why?
Absolutely. So things like olive oil are much higher in monounsaturated fats, and not so high in polyunsaturated fats. The animal fats tend to be almost kind of, depends which animal fats we're talking about here, but let's say land-based animals, they tend to be almost 50-50 saturated fats and monounsaturated fats, and they will have a little bit of polyunsaturated fats too, and they also have a little bit of trans fats, but they're not the same as the trans fats that we're about to get into. But if you talking about animal fats from the ocean, then very often they're much higher in the polyunsaturated fats. Right. But then you get even more specific. So because then you're talking about which polyunsaturated fats, because you've got omega-6s and you've got omega-3s, and they tend to be much higher in omega-3s. Omega-6s are kind of a problem all in and of themselves. So the vegetable oils that we're talking about, the kind of processed vegetable oils, things that are being have to be engineered from technical pieces of equipment. So like I say, cotton seeds, or even things like sunflower seeds to a point, but soybean is a big one. They have to go through these machines, and then they go through all these different processes to create their oil, including deodorization, because they're not palatable. So they have to go through these processes to come out to look like something somebody might want to eat.
So I think I read somewhere that when they first started making, I think cottonseed oil, I think you said was one of the first, and it was identified as a waste product that they could get oil out of. When the oil was first made, they realized that they had a product but no application for it, and it was actually industrially. And I think it was used to lubricate machinery and all kinds of things, because it was easier to come by in the middle of America than getting, fossil fuel type oils to lubricate, industrial machinery. And it wasn't until the discovery of hydrogenation that they worked out you could actually make it look like something that was human palatable. And can you explain what hydrogenation is and what trans fats are? Because I know this is a big one.
Yeah. Okay. So now finally, the world has kind of accepted that trans fats are quite literally a poison. They are essentially fats that have been damaged in a process called hydrogenation, where at very, very high pressures, hydrogen is forced through oils, and the process turns them into a solid fat. Right. And what happened is, in about 1910, as they started tinkering around with this, they discovered that once this process had occurred, the product looked exactly like lard
or butter, right? But so just to clarify here, for so there's no confusion, the only difference between a fat and an oil is whether it's solid or liquid at room temperature. Correct.
Exactly. Okay. So things that have the things that are solid at room temperatures have advantages. They tend to have longer shelf lives, but also and because your food science background, and then they also work well in baking.
Sure.
So you can't replace butter with olive oil in baking, but you can replace butter with margarine.
Yeah. Got you.
And so one of the problems, the kind of serendipitous thing for the industries, but not for people, was that at the turn of the 20th century, there were lots of problems with the hygiene of animal, these kind of inner city
husbandry.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. So not only were we poisoning our milk with tuberculosis because the conditions in dairy farms in inner cities were cramped and terrible.
So we had cows for dairy in the middle of cities, not with
absolutely,
because of transportation didn't really exist. That's crazy to think.
Yeah.
That, the only way we could have fresh milk in the centre of London was to have cows making milk in the centre of London.
Yeah, so they had, we had kind of warehouses that were being crammed full of cows that were. This is before antibiotics and before any kind of treatments, and so these cows were living in their own crap, and as we know from a million different examples, when you cannot escape your own stool, you create a bacterial infection and you eventually die. This is antibiotics feeds perfectly into that system. So rather than taking cows out of that system and giving them a bit more space, making it more hygienic, we came up with technology to solve the very problems that we caused. Pasteurization is one of those, and antibiotics is another. Obviously, there are other applications there, but so anyway, so the husbandry of inner city animals, pigs as well, and goats and sheep and whatever, created problems, and so the product, including the animal fats and the meats that were being sold in inner city markets, so was becoming controversial, and there were diseases being spread from these things. You can argue. Whatever you're, like Wuhan and those things, these horrible markets that are almost like that are very similar to the markets that were going on, 100 or so years ago.
1750 or something, right?
Exactly, yeah. The hygiene is just terrible. The animal conditions are awful. But let's not go down that rabbit hole.
In steps this miracle of modern technology called margarine.
Yeah. So this was the perfect thing, right? So there were people were becoming ill because of the hygienic issues and the lies being told to them by people selling meat that was rotten, or fat that was contaminated, or milk that had TB in it, tuberculosis. So there was this problem, and when Procter and Gamble, who were really the industry, the company that brought this to the world, they were candle makers, and they were looking at this technology of hydrogenation to create candles from the waste product cottonseed.
No, that's where it started. Not. Yeah. So it's making Okay, so the industrial oil that they're getting out of the cottonseed, they were trying to make it solid to make candles. And then,
exactly. Yeah.
And people started eating it.
So then they were like, hold on a minute, this looks like kind of like butter or lard. Let's see what it's like to bake with. And they bake with it, and then there are other advantages because the fat is already damaged in the process. It doesn't, the rancidity of it doesn't kind of get worse. So,
right.
And after deodorization, which is this process of taking away the smells, they realized that the products that you bake with it, they appear to last longer, almost forever. That's because
the Twinkie bar thing, right?
It's because they're already bad. They can't.
Already gone off. There's nothing.
Yeah, exactly. The oils
and even the
are rancid.
Even the microbes won't eat it.
Yeah, that's it. Right? Yeah, but interestingly, that's how white flour evolved, because whole grain flours were being eaten by weevils and stuff.
Yeah.
So they realised that they couldn't ship it, because it would go off, it would rot, or it would be eaten by this, that, and everything else, and rat infestations and
so
mice.
Now we have this perfect storm of the food industry trying to make as many products as they can out of already spoiled, rancid, cheap vegetable oils and hyper-processed grains, where you've stripped out anything that any other animals would want to eat, which is a pure starch. Let's see how many different things we can make out of this combination.
Yeah, exactly. And the really unfortunate thing is that they make, that combination of refined grains, horrible oils and fats, modern fats, and sugar, if you like. They create these absolutely delicious, addictive products.
Because our brains are historically programmed to respond very well to that holy trio of fat, salt, sugar, and carbohydrates. And when we were in evolutionary times, sugar and salt and fat were hard to come by, and so we get massive reward centers in the brain triggered from
exactly.
Things.
Well, the olfactory, so the nose and the brain, the kind of part in the brain that connects directly to the nose goes into kind of overdrive when it detects the combination of fats and sugars, because it doesn't come in nature, with the exception of dairy. And so dairy is designed by nature, because you might be thinking nuts, but we'll come back to that.
Right.
But the combination of the combination of fats and sugars found in dairy ensure our survival, because they are addictive. So babies want to eat lots of this breast milk.
Of course, breast milk is sweet and fatty at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Pretty rare. Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty low in protein, but it's high in sugars and it's high in fats, which is a combination perfectly designed to put on weight.
Yeah, and the colostrum and things before that is exactly sweet and sugary and
absolutely.
Of course,
so it's absolutely
that. Yeah.
It's delicious. So often people will say, "Well, what about nuts?" But the ratios are way off. So nuts, they have a little bit of carbohydrate in, and they have quite a lot of fat, but they actually only have a little bit of carbohydrate in. But if you look at breast milk or dairy of almost any animal, any mammal, they're way. They wake up way more of the percentages.
So a lot of hyper-processed foods, such as a store-bought cookie, for example, is almost mimicking the flavor profile of early breast milk.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you add another
people off.
add another kind of tier to that, which is our kind of love for, like you said, salt. And then when food science experts, the food industry, they've worked out this sweet spot of kind of sweet and sour.
Yeah.
So, you put lots of sugar in it, you put lots of fat in it, and you put a little bit of salt in it, and suddenly you've got this product that people just cannot get enough of.
Yeah,
and it lasts for ages.
Yeah, I remember when I did my food science degree, one of the case studies we did was on looking at hyperpalatable foods like Twiglets and Pringles. And it was that, as you said, it was that perfect balance of sweet, savory, umami, salty, fatty. And we did experiments of making, we went into a lab and made Twiglets, which are an extruded wheat product.
Yeah.
Different seasonings on to see which ones were the most palatable. And it's just, there is it's not a sweet spot, because it's not about sweetness, it's about the balance. And as you said, food scientists know exactly how to get that once you pop, you can't stop kind of thing. And
absolutely, yeah.
You can't just have 3 Pringles. You have to finish them all, and then you feel like crap afterwards. Well, a lot of people do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they've that is where technology is kind of, as we start learning more and more about the brain and how these, the flavour and all sorts, what we're really doing is cheating ourselves. And poisoning ourselves and just making life much harder for ourselves, really. So because these things are absolutely bloody delicious, and they really are. I can just see the marketing department of the company. I don't want to mention their name, but the kind of once you pop, can't stop thing. They must have just been falling about laughing, weren't they?
It sounds like an ad for heroin,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a bit Moorish.
Yeah. But to get us slightly back on track, we've talked about, that you had this perfect storm of a product almost looking for an application that solved a problem created by poor food hygiene. So what is it about these high omega-6 hydrogenated vegetable oils that make them bad for us? What do they actually do to us? And where does the problem lie? And how does that compare to the natural fats that they're replacing?
Right. So there are two separate problems there, as far as I see it. The first problem is that people's diets modern diets tend to be much, much higher in omega-6 than in omega-3. So we need to kind of cut back on omega-6s just because they're so freely available in so many modern foods.
And just to recap, omega-3 and 6, and I believe 9, they're just different chain lengths of a type of polyunsaturated, which means some of the bonds aren't filled within the fat molecule. Is that?
Yeah. So exactly. So polyunsaturated fats have more than one double bond, which makes them less stable, which gives them pros and cons depending on what you want to do with them. So really, just going back to what that means kind of diet-wise is if a fat is less stable, it means it's more likely to damage and become oxidized. Right. And then if a fat has become oxidized, then it creates an inflammatory issue in the body.
Right. So that's where the problem lies. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the two. The first problem is that we tend to have too much omega-6, whether or not that is being oxidized and damaged.
So you say too much. Do we need a little bit of omega-6 then? Is it good to have some of all of those three kinds, or should we just avoid omega-6 completely? And is that even possible?
It's not possible, no, because all fats that you consume, all natural fats, have all the different types of fat in them.
In different proportions? In
different ratios.
Got you.
But they're called whatever the majority of the fat happens to be. So people call beef fat, they call that saturated fat because it's about, well, depending on the database you look at, it might be 50 or 55% saturated fat.
Right.
And then it might be 40% monounsaturated fat. And then the rest of it will be made up with the different polyunsaturated fats. So that's the first thing people have to get their heads around. It's not, surprise, surprise, as simple as just being one type of fat. All fats that are found in nature are all the fats.
Right.
It's just talking about the majority, the major part of it. So lard is always spoken about as if it's a saturated fat, but in fact, the majority of it is monounsaturated fat.
There's a lot of oleic acid in lard, right?
Yeah. So, and then, so now, you can even start being specific about which types of saturated fats are in what and which, so it's seriously complex. And excuse me, one of the problems I have with the research on fats is that they almost never tell you what the specific type of fat is. They might say it's saturated or unsaturated because it suits their belief. It suits their narrative because it suits their sponsor, right? And but what they should tell you is exactly what type of fat is being looked at, being studied, and what condition it's in. Because I want to know if this rodent study that they've done that showed them all kind of dying of heart disease or whatever. I want to know if that was an oxidized polyunsaturated fat like sunflower oil. Because very often they'll say saturated fat, and sometimes they'll call it saturated fat because it's actually just a trans fat, because they've kind of turned it into, even though that's not technically right, but the title will be this saturated fat has caused heart disease in these rodents.
And of course, by the time it gets out to the press, the people are only reading the abstracts anyway.
Yeah, if that. I mean, they don't get past the title, and the journalist has no understanding of it. They miss the word linked, associated, or correlated, and that turns into don't eat beef.
Or that turns into the game changers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Sorry. So just to grab the reins again. What is it about having too much omega-6? What is it? You mentioned inflammation. Is that the problem? Is that what it does? How does that manifest in the body?
Yeah. So I think it is the problem. I think so. If people are chronically inflamed, they're going to get ill sooner or later. Right? Simple as. You can't. Disease does not exist in the absence of inflammation. In acute injury, there's inflammation, and in chronic disease, there's inflammation. So anything you can do to reduce inflammation is going to help. So obviously but it's important to remember that inflammation is a necessary process in the body, but it's really about control. So when things become errant, when you lose control of inflammation, it becomes chronic inflammation, and it causes things, lots of things, but let's say oxidative stress, right? Mm-hmm. So oxidative stress is perfect with these, because that is what happens to these kind of vegetable oils that go through these industrial processes. Trans fats are basically, they're not exactly the same actually, but it's not completely wrong to think of oxidized fats as trans fats. They're both damaged, and when you eat them, they both create an inflammatory response that needs to be dampened by the body's systems, and normally antioxidant systems, right? Okay. But so this is why some people, let's say some young people, some athletes, let's say an 18, 19, 20-year-old athlete can eat junk, right, and still perform at an incredible level, and still ostensibly be really healthy. But what they're doing is they are degrading their ability to continue into a later age, because they are using up their antioxidant, anti-inflammatory systems, which means lots and lots of nutrients that go into building these things, and cellular function. So you can talk about mitochondrial function here, which is the energy-producing parts of the cell, i.e. how the cell performs and how it functions, and therefore how the organ functions. So, if you eat these vegetable oils that are already damaged, or that are likely to be damaged as you eat them, because they're either very high in unstable, in other words, easily damaged fats, you are then using up your ability to dampen and dissolve that, reduce that problem, which is the inflammation and oxidative stress. So if you eat a diet high in these junk oils, which is to say, either you might, it's a real shame, but people have these big tubs of these awful, seriously cheap oils next to their ovens or whatever, and they use them to fry with. And that is what makes frying bad for you, right? It doesn't, if you use a a stable fat like beef dripping, or even a monounsaturated fat like lard, which is still a lot more stable to cook with, then you're not getting the same problem. It's not the same as frying with a sunflower oil or with a soybean or whatever, some cheap generic plant oil, because of the oxidation and the damage.
Right.
So if you do lots of that, right, at age 20, you might get away with it because you're able to dampen that problem. But
it's
as you get older,
yeah.
Exactly, as you get older, you start getting, you get into your 40s or whatever, all of a sudden you lose the ability to reduce that oxidative stress and that
bit sooner
inflammation.
than you might have done had you.
Exactly, yeah. And so that problem, which is very, very gut related, because of course that's where the insult is actually entering the body, that starts to spread outside of the digestion, and then you start getting problems with oxidative stress, like, for example, oxidized LDL is the obvious one. So that's oxidized cholesterol. So you go down the realms of high LDL. Well, is LDL the problem, or is it oxidized LDL? And therefore, is that a problem with oxidation and chronic inflammation? And, is that the real issue behind?
So this, we're talking high people that get called out, doctors put them on statins in their mid-40s because their LDL or low density lipoproteins are high, and that is caused often by oxidative stress that could have come from overconsumption of seed oils, or just general oxidative stress compounding that. So could it be that a mixture of bit of a poor diet plus a lot of personal life work stress plus lack of sleep, which also are contributing to inflammation, all of these lifestyle factors wrapped together are what's causing your quote unquote high levels of cholesterol or measurements of low density lipoprotein? Is that kind of fair?
Yeah. So just something that we want to just iron out there was so. You might get a reading of a high LDL, right? But that tells you nothing about your oxidized LDL, which really is the kind of killer. It also doesn't tell you much about what type of LDL. So is it the kind of dangerous type, which is these dense, small, type of LDL, or is it this kind of fluffy type, which is not so problematic? The problem is the test you get in the doctors, the bog standard test, it doesn't tell the doctors, it doesn't give the doctor enough information. Well, because the problem is there's an entire industry grown up around just the LDL number. So we're all, which is statins, obviously. So what people need to be doing is asking, not just about the number of the level of their LDL, but what type of LDL it is, and how much of it is oxidized, and whether or not that is actually creating plaques in the arteries, because of course it's plaques that are causing the real problems.
The stroke, heart attack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we definitely need to be asking more.
Are these tests? I know. People who are my age who have been doctors have put them on statins just based on cholesterol levels. And then I've also seen some people who are doctors within the carnivore community, if you want to call it that, people who eat only red meat and animal fats, whose cholesterol levels on paper are insanely high, yet they're incredibly healthy people. Is that the difference in how much of it is oxidized?
Yeah, absolutely. So saturated fat will raise the level of LDL in let's say most people. It's very likely that the LDL level will go up. But there's this whole thing about whether or not that's dangerous because of the problems we've just discussed, like how much of it is oxidized, what type of LDL it is, etc., etc. The other thing is what's your level of HDL? So HDL is about which direction the cholesterol is going. Is the body clearing cholesterol at a healthy level? A higher HDL level will indicate that the body is actually keeping things in balance.
Can we just do a bit of throw some definitions in here? So LDL and HDL are measures of lipoproteins, so they're the transport mechanisms for the cholesterol molecule. Is that correct?
Yeah. So cholesterol is all the same. It's the imagine cholesterol as the passenger inside a taxi, and the taxi is the lipoprotein that we talk about.
Right.
LDL is a lipoprotein, is the taxi, and HDL is the taxi, and they're going in opposite directions. LDL, and they have a different density, but LDL is taking things away from the liver. HDL is taking things back into the liver for processing.
Okay.
So it's important to know more than just the LDL, because the trouble is, like I say, statins are such a big industry that people will just look. I mean, and I've had this experience. I've been to the doctor, and they do all these tests, and I watched him. He looked at the LDL and he goes, "Oh, LDL's a bit high. What we'll do is we'll medicate for that." And I was like, "No, we won't." But I said, "What about the ratio? You haven't even looked at what is the ratio between the LDL, HDL, and the triglycerides, or the HDL type triglycerides ratio? I want to know that. And also, can you tell me how much of that LDL is oxidized?" And they're like, "Oh, yeah, okay." So so the thing is, it's because a lot of them have been trained, and I don't want to kind of attack this system at all, but a lot of them have been trained to look at LDL and they go, "Okay, you need statins." Right. Because
so it's a simple box tick. If it's above this level, prescribe this drug.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's the action of a statin? What does it do?
So it blocks an enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase, which causes the production. So that's the body's production of cholesterol. Right,
because it's made in the liver. Gut.
It's so and some of it's made in cells, and some of it's made in the brain. Yeah. Cholesterol is so important for cellular function
that without it we die.
Exactly, right. But everyone's in this kind of race to get it as low as possible. Whilst this is what I meant. At the beginning we talked about the nuances and all the different variables, and this is like a massive area where you really, really need to know more than just the LDL number, and even more than just the LDL, the HDL, and the triglyceride, the blood fat number. We really do. But yeah, so we kind of got off on one there. I want to track back to why vegetable oils feeds into this, right? So if you're eating lots of these vegetable oils because you think that polyunsaturated fats, full stop, are healthier than saturated fats, full stop, because that is the general perception because of marketing of things like margarines, which takes us back to their initial production, Procter and Gamble, and those fats that they produced are high in polyunsaturated fats, and they created margarines. Crisco was one of the first products, and so we have been kind of brainwashed into believing that polyunsaturated fats are better for us than saturated fats. And the problem is that the science, some of the research, and a lot of it is questionable, but a lot of the research shows that saturated fat raises LDL and polyunsaturated fat lowers LDL. But let's not talk about LDL because we've kind of done that. There's more to talk about with LDL. But so the problem with that is that it's not making people healthier. There's now evidence that higher LDL actually increases longevity.
I've read that recently.
Yeah. And also
it's looked at in a lot of people in the sort of anti-aging research that they've looked at a lot of centenarians that have very, very high levels. And also how quickly people's skin ages is linked to your cholesterol levels, I've read as well.
Cholesterol is absolutely vital. we had this war on cholesterol, which is just ridiculous, and so much of it is politicized, which I can talk about in a second. But so I just want to kind of get through that, why vegetable oils thinks it's bad. So the people have believed that polyunsaturated fats are better because of that simple argument of lowering LDL. So we started adding way too many polyunsaturated fats, whether or not they are damaged or not, into the diet, and it's creating problems, chronic inflammation and oxidative stress, which is then those problems are reaching way beyond our digestion, way beyond the problems with dampening them that we are better able to do as a young person, or as a, because we've got more nutrients or whatever. As the antioxidant system in the body starts to reduce as we get older, or because our diets are chronically bad, means that you start getting problems with oxidative stress in the blood, which then makes the LDL poisonous. So hopefully that is not too kind of confusing.
No, so just to sum that up, so as I understand it, high levels of LDL on their own, as a doctor would measure, don't tell you enough about your state of health, and you should not, really be prepared to do anything to change that unless you know an awful lot more. The important thing to know is the ratio between LDL, HDL, and total triglycerides, but also how much oxidized LDL there is. And somebody who maybe is eating a little bit too much omega-6, which could be inflammatory, if the rest of their diet is high enough in antioxidants, you can to some degree offset that, but you're using money in the bank that could be used for later for improving your health. So the general rule here is stay away from processed seed oils that are high in LDL, are high in omega-6. Don't worry so much about natural oils from animal fats.
Absolutely, that's it in a nutshell. Because you can. There's also the kind of evolutionary argument, which is okay. Modern vegetable oils, the ones that we've been discussing, just simply didn't exist until 1910. Okay, so they are not very old, and we are definitely not evolved to eat them. But fats from animals, all sorts of animals, whether they're omega-3s from fish or whether they're saturated fats from different types of, four-legged herbivores or whatever, we've been eating those since way before we were modern humans, in huge amounts, because the evidence is literally piles of bones that show butchering marks and piles of shells in caves that are millions of years old, which of course were not modern humans, but they were Homo erectus, which are very similar to Homo sapiens, which is what we are. They're only kind of a couple of steps away.
And I think a really good point to sort of throw in here as well is one of the reasons why our business, apart from the ecological aspect of it, but one of the reasons we founded our business on only pasture-raised meat from grazing animals. So when we feed grains to animals whose natural diet is pasture, it affects the omega-6 and 3 balance within the fats of that meat that we then consume. So it may be a bit of a crass analogy, but if we're eating 100% pasture-raised beef, it's more higher omega-3, so it's more like a fish oil type fat to our body. If we eat grain-finished, intensively reared beef that's had a lot of grains, then the fat in the beef is higher in omega-6. It's more like a vegetable type oil, even though it's coming from an animal. So again, the nuance is in there in that the grains mess up animals that we then eat if we allow ourselves to go down that route. But that's not quite the same with the monogastrics, with the pork and the poultry, who seem to not have that quite that same response to the omega-6 from eating grains, because the animals are naturally omnivorous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So pigs, they've been kind of snuffling around looking for, kind of seeds and grains and anything else, and so they're adapted to eat those things, as well as, I mean, it's funny, the more cameras in our environment, the more revelations we're discovering about actually the simple fact that animals will not turn their nose up any calorie source, really, energy or nutrient source. There's footage of goats eating, ducklings or little chicks and stuff, because they're right there in front of them, and they're like, oh yeah, all right then, why would I turn this down?
There is one thing that I think I'm right in saying all animals will refuse to eat, and that's margarine.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And GM corn, as Instagram would have you to believe. I mean, I'd like to do that experiment myself. But yeah. I mean, we could go down the GM thing as well. If you know.
We're going to save that for another podcast.
That's a big one.
We'll be here till Thursday.
Yeah.
Tim, we've been on for like an hour and a half now. I think we'd probably better wrap this up. Is there anything else that you want to add in, or tell people about where they can find you and your work? I'll put links in and things, of course, but what have you got coming up? Is there any? I know that you're involved in a project. I just don't know if you can talk about it yet. But
I think so. Yeah. So I'm co-writing a food lies book. So a chap called Brian Sanders, who has a kind of online presence under the name Food Lies, which you can find very easily with Google or on Instagram or whatever. He's got a really good presence. And he puts out some really, really good stuff. He's making a documentary film, and I'm co-writing the book with him, which we're not a million miles.
When's it out? And
so, good question, because the documentary is the priority, and the book, the book is allows us to go into more details, and so I'm allowed. The reason why I know kind of so much about the history of a lot of these things we've discussed is because of the research for that book. And so there's loads of history and quite a lot of the politics around the food lies that we've been told.
Industrialization of food,
yeah. So Brian is really busy on the movie. And once that is done, then we'll know about when the book is going to come out. But so we don't know yet. But they should follow. If people are interested, they can follow me, Tim Rees Nutrition, Tim Rees _nutrition on Instagram. I'm not prolific on Instagram. I'm much more active on Twitter, which is nutritional the 3. Yeah,
I'll
put my name in.
Links in with the.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
That'd be great.
And then I'm also if anybody knows anybody with Meniere's disease, which is something that I've suffer still, but I manage very, very well with nutrition. I mean, I've actually managed away all the problems minus the tinnitus from Meniere's, and I do that with nutrition. But if people know anybody or people suffer from that, I'm very interested in hearing from them, because I'd like to put a group together, and this would be for free. I'd like to get a group of very up for it people with that condition that I can help.
Okay.
When I say up for it, I mean they need to be doing a very strict exclusion diet, and it would be they would see the first signs of benefit within 2 weeks, I believe. But I'm really trying to get a group of people together. So,
can you just tell us what Meniere's is? I know it's an autoimmune condition, but specifically, what is it?
It's an inner autoimmune condition, the symptoms of which are instantaneous vertigo that can be very, very destructive. It can take you from feeling completely normal to being aggressively pinned to the floor for anything between seconds to hours. absolutely unable to move to help yourself. That happened to me. Well, I mean, over the years, many times. I was pinned to a railing in South London. Fortunately, I wasn't too far away from my flat, and I was able to get back to my flat for about 10 minutes or so. But I had to do it with my eyes shut, and I was dragging myself along this railing because, of course, the inner ear is about balance, and you are quite literally pinned. It's like somebody has got your head and they are pinning you against it. Also, I was pinned against a coffee table for hours in a coffee shop. And that happened all over the place. I ended up lying on the floor of a disabled toilet, kind of piss-soaked floor, for hours, because I just couldn't move. And you just have to wait until the attack finishes, and then you feel like absolute death afterwards.
And is this quite you said you want to hear from people. Is this a relatively common affliction, or
not really? No, but anybody who knows somebody with it will know of it. Right. But it's depending on what you look at, it's kind of 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 2,000 people have it.
That's quite a lot, though.
Yeah.
That means within our community, we should be able to hopefully find some people and point them in your direction.
People's experience of it is very different. Some people will go from attack to attack feeling normal. Other people will be completely deaf, or they will have intermittent hearing loss. They'll have either mild tinnitus or very, very serious tinnitus. They will have dizziness that will last maybe for seconds to days or weeks. So really, people's experience of it is very different. But anyway, it's very, very horrible. And I'm keen to help people, but only if they're keen to help themselves.
Fair enough.
This is not a passive. Oh, let's have a look, see what Tim's offering.
Give you a tablet and you'll be sorted. Yeah,
exactly. They will be removing lots and lots of foods. Gluten, dairy, sugar, alcohol for starters, and lots of other things. Really, I've got an exclusion diet that I'm starting to kind of shape, and I think it could be really powerful. But most people don't want to do it. I met with a doctor who, as luck would have it, half an hour down the road from me here, a doctor specialises in Meniere's disease. He's like the only guy that does. But what he does is he uses kind of Chinese medicine acupuncture. He's a medical doctor, but he uses alternative medicine to treat allergic response, and he kind of goes that way to lessen people's attacks.
Yeah.
But so I hooked up with him in English sense again. But we had a meeting. And I said to him, look, I can help people, your clients, with nutrition changes. And he was like, okay, I'm up for it. I've got some people that might be interested. So he sent me their details. But the trouble is, they were like, no, I don't want to change my diet. I don't want to give up bread. That was the issue.
And you're in Germany, where they love baked goods and breads and
bread and dairy are big here, and they were like, oh no, I'd much prefer to pay a fortune and have a treatment that they consider passive.
Right.
And that's great. I mean, if it works, God, I would do passive treatments if I could. I've tried them all, but that's not what I offer. And quite frankly, that they're not the kind of clients I want. I want people that are up for it, and I want this Meniere's group because I want to do it for them for nothing. Yeah. It would be a kind of collab. It would be exactly, and they'd all kind of follow this diet, and I'd be very, very interested to see, as long as they were 100%, how their disease progressed. And really, I want to hear from people that are very ill, people that are having attacks often. I was having attacks 4 or 5 times a day at its worst, which was quite literally ruining my life.
Imagine.
And it was diet therapy was the only thing that helped.
Got you. Okay, we'll put that out. We'll put that out with the the notes and see if we can put people directly in touch with you. But I think
nice one. Thanks, Glenn.
At 1:40, I think we'd better wrap up.
Yeah, it's enough. Yeah, it's enough.
And I think I can see many occasions where we can talk again in the future. But thank you for your time today, Tim.
Pleasure. Thanks, Glenn.